Thank you very much, Tim Morris, for your introduction. It is a great honour to be invited to deliver this lecture in memory of a great conservative who helped to shape modern Britain, and a special honour to deliver it under the auspices of the Centre for Policy Studies, the organisation that he founded with Margaret Thatcher 40 years ago this June, to promulgate the new thinking that was so badly needed in our country. I understand that Lady Joseph attended all of these lectures, and I was sorry to hear of her recent death, but I'm pleased that so many members of the Joseph family are here this evening. Thank you for coming. Margaret Thatcher said of Keith Joseph, "I could not have become leader of the opposition or achieved what I did as Prime Minister without Keith," describing Joseph as my closest political friend. As august a journal as the Sunday Mirror said, he was, quote, "a man of strange contradictions, the Tory minister who really cares." His role in shaping Britain over the last 40 years continues to stimulate debate, with James Landale's documentary, Thatcher's Mad Monk or True Prophet, due to go out on air next Monday evening. Keith Joseph provides much of the inspiration for my remarks this evening, but if you will forgive an uncharacteristic display of sycophancy, so too does our chairman, Maurice Sargent. And MPs don't do AV, but if you didn't see Maurice's Newsnight interview, here is the clip.
Well, I'm the chairman of a very fine body called the Centre for Policy Studies, created by Mrs. Thatcher many years ago, which was responsible for some iconic policies that certainly helped the Conservative Party to win many elections, including, of course, you can own your own home, the sale of council houses. So we are going to have to develop, and we will, a policy, just one, because more than one is already too complicated, before the next election, which has the iconic status in terms of appeal and simplicity of you can own your own home. That's our aim in the Centre for Policy Studies, and we'll do it. And this will have a big impact.
Do you know what that policy is going to be about?
Yes.
Go on.
It's going to be about freedom. It's going to be about freedom and the connection between freedom and money, because we are not going to shy away from the fact that to speak about freedom without speaking about money is hypocrisy.
Wonderfully simple, clear message. And there's a golden thread that connects Keith Joseph to Maurice Sargent's theme there of freedom and the connection between freedom and money. Elsewhere in Maurice's interview, he quoted J.K. Galbraith, saying that the greatest restriction on the freedom of the citizen is the complete absence of money. Joseph described our reiterated conviction that a market economy with freedom to own property and engage in production and services is an essential condition for all other freedoms. This thread was picked up by the current Chancellor of the Exchequer to great effect in his budget a fortnight ago, as he recognised the power of giving people control over their own lives, the fruits of their own labours. I shall return to this later in my remarks. Few politicians younger than I will remember Keith Joseph. I was lucky enough to meet him once or twice, and I will always remember, some of you will have been there, hearing him address a CPS annual meeting, standing in for Lady Thatcher shortly after her departure from Downing Street. His whole speech was couched in terms of what he imagined she would have wanted to say had she been there in person. It was a remarkable spectacle, given the extent to which he had influenced, even crafted, the ideas that she brought into concrete form. He was famously better at having ideas than he was at implementing them in ministerial office. One can only wonder at his reaction when, after his first parliamentary outing as a junior minister in Macmillan's government, the Prime Minister complimented him on the performance, but added, "If it's any consolation, it will get worse." He was a slightly unworldly man who didn't have a television in the house and who reputedly, once dissatisfied with the live television interview, asked to do it again. "I thought you realised, Sir Keith," said the producer, "that this was to be a live interview." "Yes, I know that," said Joseph. "That's why I wanted to do it again." This evening I shall begin by quoting Lady Thatcher when she gave this lecture in 1996. She said, In politics, integrity really lies in the conviction that it's only on the basis of truth that power should be won, or indeed can be worth winning. It lies in the unswerving belief that you have to be right. She continued, it was not that Keith wore a hair shirt from preference. He was averse to any kind of suffering, especially other people's, and applying the right remedies to the British disease was bound to require suffering. But Keith's integrity was absolute. When he became convinced, finally convinced, after the endless discussions which were a mark of his open-hearted style, that a proposition was correct, he felt he had to defend it. He had to fight for it. When he faced those raging, spitting, Trotskyist crowds at our great liberal centres of learning, I suspect he wondered sometimes whether he would have to die for it. But there he stood. He could do no other. This brings me to my first Keith Joseph-inspired theme, the importance of ideas, thought and debate in politics, and the massive damage that has been done to British politics by the fatuous insistence that we should all be on message at all times. We know, of course, that progress in politics and political thought is only achieved through a constant process of challenge and debate. At the root of the Westminster model is an attempt to guarantee that challenge takes place by formalising an adversarial approach to politics. The propositions advanced by government will be scrutinised by an official opposition, even if the government's own side is happy to go with the flow. The inherent danger in our parliamentary model is that both sides can be trapped in a role play, the ever-critical opposition and the lobby fodder on the government side. In an adversarial system, there is nothing new in the temptation to regard those who from time to time seek to challenge their own side's ideas as boat rockers, perhaps even traitors. All these charges were levelled against Keith Joseph in 1974, when he had the courage to ascribe the blame for dangerous inflation to the Heath government and not just to the new administration under Wilson. Joseph had the fundamental honesty to recognise his own mistakes too, famously declaring, "It was only in April 1974 that I was converted to conservatism. I had thought that I was a conservative, but now I see that I was not really one at all." As he travelled the length and breadth of the country, making his case for liberty, for a state that would be the servant of free people, not their master, his speeches, in Margaret Thatcher's words, fundamentally affected a political generation's way of thinking. He was quite clear that if he was to make his case and see his ideas implemented, he had to change the mainstream of his own party as well as that of the other side. As he said in establishing the Centre for Policy Studies, "My aim was to convert the Tory party." But if it was difficult in the 1970s to challenge a prevailing climate of ideas, how much harder is it in the politics of today? Not only do we have the inherent tension afflicting any party politician, do we speak our minds and exercise the judgment that our constituents have a right to expect, or do we remain silent, do the whip's bidding and avoid rocking the boat? Today, we have, with a few honourable exceptions, doubtless all here tonight, a dumbed-down media. Some are happy to enter a Faustian pact with those who manage the news for whichever party. Others are looking only for the maverick and the rebel. When good men and women come to differing conclusions within a party, it must be written up as a rebellion or a challenge to authority. Political parties have become over-reliant on focus groups and opinion research to identify the key target voters in key swing seats. The message is too often crafted to appeal, not to be right. And the biggest focus group of all, the British electorate, grows ever more disenchanted. All the mainstream parties struggle with falling membership and bemoan the dismally low turnout among younger voters in particular. We shake our heads in consternation that 18 to 24-year-olds appear all too often uninterested in the democratic process. It has become a truism to point out that the young are attracted to single-issue campaigns but turned off by party politics. But we accept this as inevitable at our peril. It is my experience that the young are repelled by parties because they equate political parties with humbug. Every time a solemn pre-election pledge is cast aside, the problem grows worse. Every time a politician on television evades a straight question, he confirms the stereotype. It has become fashionable to regard our democratic system as a pointless charade. And at the core of the problem lies the readiness of too many in politics to treat the public as fools. The shine eventually wore off Tony Blair when people came to the view that he had manipulated the evidence to justify a war. Gordon Brown's brief honeymoon as Prime Minister ended when he dissimulated over the election that never was. Nick Clegg's poll rating has never recovered from a broken pledge over tuition fees. And to prove my even-handedness, I will add that what was perceived as the breach of a copper-bottomed guarantee to hold a referendum on the Lisbon Treaty certainly contributed to the failure of my party to win the general election outright in 2010. That is why David Cameron's absolute commitment to legislate for a referendum on the EU is so important. I don't think it is patronising to say that the idealistic young are more readily offended by these traits than those of us who have been disappointed more often. But this view is far from a monopoly of the young. When Russell Brand told Jeremy Paxman that there is no point in voting and advocated revolution, we might have allowed ourselves to harumph. But when Paxman reveals that he doesn't bother voting either, I think that is cause for real concern. The trouble is that a significant number of serious, engaged and community-minded people are coming to the same conclusion, that our parliamentary system fails adequately to serve its intended purpose. It may be that turnout in general elections has fallen from 84% in 1950 to 65% in 2010, because people perceive a smaller difference between the parties, in which case Mr. Miliband's shift to the left might help reverse the trend. But there is plenty of evidence from the Hansard Society and others that voter participation has fallen because so many people think that voting doesn't really change things. As responsibility is shifted to supranational institutions at one end and to quangos or independent reviews at the other, they have a point. As ever, the Liberal Democrats jump to the wrong conclusion and seek to change the voting system. As the AV referendum showed, there is no public appetite for electoral reform. In fact, believe it or not, we MPs tend to be held in quite high esteem by our constituents. They don't worry too much about how we are chosen. By and large, they don't even regret the people they choose. The problem arises when we arrive at Westminster. It is the institutions of our democracy that need to change, not the electoral system. In 2009, in the midst of a parliamentary crisis, David Cameron set out an ambitious agenda for reform. In government, he would end the pliant role of Parliament by giving MPs free votes during the consideration of bills at committee stage. MPs would also be handed the crucial power of deciding the timetable of bills. He would boost the power of backbench MPs and limit the powers of the executive by allowing MPs to choose the chairs and members of Commons Select Committees. He would limit the power of the Prime Minister by giving serious consideration to introducing fixed-term parliaments, ending the right of Downing Street to control the timing of general elections. Some of this agenda has been delivered. Select committees are elected, and we have, regrettably in my view, a fixed parliamentary term. But free votes? Allowing Parliament to timetable bills for itself? It made it into the coalition agreement, but has been allowed to fall by the wayside in the interests of executive convenience. I've become convinced that public trust in Parliament will only really be restored by radical reform, by removing the executive from Parliament, freeing Parliament from patronage and control of government. But there remains a rich seam of reforms short of a full separation of powers that would help restore confidence and independence to the House of Commons. Control over our own agenda, timetable, more powers for select committees, and more free votes might be the next stage of reform. We will know that progress has been made when MPs no longer give up a place on an elected select committee in order to take up an offer to serve as a parliamentary private secretary to a junior minister. Drawing lessons from the life of Keith Joseph, we should do all of this because it is right. We should do it because our country is in desperate need of open, honest debate, and a strong, free parliament would allow that. We should do it too because there is a public hunger for change, for the rebuilding of institutions that people can trust. Our parliament should be the forum for genuine debate, where ideas are welcomed, where real challenge and scrutiny is seen by governments as a benefit, not an inconvenience. Earlier I listed some negatives, instances where political dishonesty, real or perceived, has moved the public. The flip side is just as clear. David Cameron actually vetoing an EU treaty. John Prescott's reputation rising when he delivered a very honest right hook to an egg-throwing idiot. And right to the present day, where we see the galvanising effect of a budget that rings true as a Conservative prescription. And this brings me to my second theme this evening. When I began preparing this lecture a few weeks ago, I planned to call for a savings revolution. Had this event, Morris, taken place on the 2nd of March, not the 2nd of April, it would now be regarded as having been immensely influential. In trusting people to make their own decisions, trusting people to take responsibility for their own future, trusting them with their own money, George Osborne has achieved two important goals in one stroke. Firstly, he has done something believable, something that the nation sees as true to our principles. This is key to building the brand identity that will be in the minds of voters in next year's general election. Secondly, the boldness of the move should help to set the scene for the great challenges that lie ahead. For in the announcement of a new, more liberal regime for pensions and savings, and in Labour's reaction to it, we see the battle of ideas that was at the heart of Keith Joseph's conversion of the Conservative Party, a battle that is at least as relevant today as it was 40 years ago. As Nigel Vinson wrote for the CPS in 1983, to argue for the status quo is to argue for the perpetuation of a gross injustice on most future pensioners. We believe our proposals would rectify this and at the same time bring all the benefits that come from having a wider, capital-owning society. Immediately after the budget, the Labour Party hesitated, instinctively drawn to attack as irresponsible the shift of such important powers into the hands of the people most directly affected by them. Within a day or two, Labour had rightly come to the conclusion that it would be foolhardy to place itself in opposition to such a powerful alignment of interests. As Stuart Hall, the socialist thinker who coined the term Thatcherism, put it, nothing so rattles the equanimity of Labour leaders as the spectacle of the popular classes on the move, under their own steam, outside the range of responsible guidance and leadership. The Conservative governments of the 1980s and 90s began an unprecedented period of growth of personal wealth. The increase of home ownership, including so many council tenants for whom ownership was a new experience, the growth of private pensions, tax-exempt savings, and attempts to establish popular capitalism through wide distribution of shares and privatisation issues, all played a part. At the end of the First World War, less than a quarter of people in England and Wales owned their own property. By 1970, there was an equal split between owner-occupiers and rental occupancy. By 2001, almost 70% of us owned our own home. Home ownership not only generates personal wealth, it means people have somewhere to live, it also gives a psychological sense of worth from owning a sizable asset, as well as the comfort of knowing we have something to pass on to future generations. Nick Ridley described this concept of a property-owning democracy in his book My Style of Government as one, as he said, first articulated by Anthony Eden, but a course hardly advanced at all by successive Tory governments. And he defined it thus: to own one's own house or business or the capital which produced one's retirement income, extended freedom of choice, gave people a stake in the nation's wealth and required less taxpayers' money to be spent on them. It produced a large and growing number of people who were not dependent. Margaret Thatcher went further in ascribing a powerful psychological effect. She said of all the rights that we call liberty, the right to own property, though one of the more prosaic, is arguably that of the greatest practical importance. Owning property gives a man independence against overweening government. Property ownership has also a more mysterious but no less real effect. Looking after what one owns provides the training in responsible citizenship. There are those who contest that the UK has historically set far too much store by home ownership and that we should be unconcerned that the average age of the first-time buyer is approaching 40. But taken together, This trend, the spread of means-tested benefits, the regime for long-term care, the damage done to private pension provision by one of Gordon Brown's earliest misjudgments, compounded by a squeeze on household finances from which we are only slowly emerging, which saw over 1 million people forced to abandon contributions to their pension funds, all amounted to a massive turn away from a culture of property ownership with the responsibility and independence that goes with it. Our houses are sometimes seen as a national obsession, but we should consider too the progress in creating a share-owning democracy. The Thatcher-inspired privatisations, BT and BP, made millions of ordinary citizens into shareholders for the first time. Similarly, the introduction of employee share schemes in the 1980s led to millions of employees gaining a financial stake in their employer for the first time. These actions had numerous benefits. Employee share ownership provided employees with a tax-efficient savings and investment vehicle, boosted the UK savings ratio, gave employees a financial nest egg for their future, and enabled workers to gain a real stake in the company that they worked for. It provided employers with a more motivated, productive, and engaged workforce, where their interests became more closely aligned with that of their employers. Again, Nigel Vinson put this well in his pamphlet, Owners All, published by the CPS in 1985. Wider personal ownership, and consequent upon it, greater individual commitment to success, is essential if we are to create wealth as a nation, thereby laying a foundation for increased employment and for adequate resources to pay for welfare. The government should acknowledge the disadvantages, the dangers, indeed, of the present concentration of wealth, and make wider ownership a basic theme of the 1986 budget and a major part of the platform for the next election. These are benefits that continue to be recognised by many British companies, and I'm pleased that this government has recently taken steps to re-energise the concept of a shareholder democracy, with the privatisation of Royal Mail being a good example. At Royal Mail today, more than 99% of employees are now shareholders in the company they work for, by virtue of the free shares awarded when it was privatised. Even though employee share ownership was neglected by government for many years, 80% of FTSE 100 companies already offer some form of all-employee share scheme. The Chancellor's decision last year to increase the allowances for employee share schemes and share save were perhaps an early indication of the wider agenda to promote pensions and savings that we've seen in this year's budget. Masses has been written and spoken about the baby boomers who have had it all: free tuition, free healthcare, cradle-to-grave welfare, affordable home ownership, early retirement and low taxes. The Pensions Minister recently wrote to me with a pithy encapsulation of how the National Insurance Fund is meant to work. He said, the NI scheme operates on a pay-as-you-go basis. This means that today's contributors are paying for today's social security entitlements and pensions, and those paying contributions previously were paying for the pensioners at that time. In other words, contributors do not accumulate an individual fund of actual monies they have paid, which is personal to them. Indeed, payment of contributions entitles them to a range of social security entitlements which are available on the basis of the rules applicable at the time of the claim. How much better to own something than depend on that? All very well, as long as the proportion of working age, tax-paying citizens is maintained and productivity continues to increase. Given that neither of these conditions is being met, many of our younger countrymen might be forgiven for thinking that they have been sold a pup. They have to pay their taxes to support older generations in retirement, whilst increasingly having to provide for themselves and their children, and to work much longer in order to do so. All this is compounded by the scale of the fiscal mess in which we find ourselves. I haven't time to rehearse the figures, but even though the deficit will have been halved by next year from the figure in 2010, the government is still expecting to borrow another £108 billion this year and a further £95 billion the next. These, of course, are only the explicit debts, taking no account of the massive unfunded obligations implied by ongoing pension, welfare, health and social obligations. So it is clear that the road to be walked by the next government and the one after that may involve just as many tough choices as being faced in this Parliament. It is pretty clear that future generations will look in vain to the state if they want to retire early, put their children through university or ride on buses free of charge. Instead of dwelling on the bad news of the massive public liabilities that the developing world faces, I want to turn though to the good news story of the expansion of private wealth. As my parliamentary colleagues who are present know well, our constituency surgeries are much more occupied with helping those who depend on welfare or social provision than those who are able to provide for themselves. If you own your own home, have adequate funded pension provision, and perhaps even private health insurance, you are much less likely to need to ask for help. And the numbers of people in our country with this buffer of private assets has grown dramatically. Some of this has been through the kind of savings vehicles that the Chancellor has been promoting. Before the financial crisis, the number of new ISA accounts opened each year had reached over 15 million. By 2012-13, a record £57 billion was subscribed to adult ISAs, and the total value of assets held in them had reached £443 billion. Crucially, the majority of ISA holders in 2010-11 had incomes below £20,000 a year. The privately held wealth of the British people, which had remained broadly static from the Second World War until 1980, has been growing ever since, from £1 trillion in the 1970s to £5 trillion by 2005, at constant prices. Much of this increase has been in the value of people's homes, but also reflects rising levels of home ownership. If private pensions are added, the total rises to £6.5 trillion. Between 2008 to 10, not a particularly auspicious time to survey wealth, the ONS Wealth and Assets Survey found the total value of personal wealth in this country to be fully £10 trillion. Median household wealth, including pension savings, was put at £232,000, 12 times the value of median household income. The growing personal wealth comes at the same time as public debt has been mushrooming. Taken as a whole, the wealth of the British people massively outranks all the sovereign wealth funds of the world. Keith Joseph said, "Egalitarianism destroys not only prosperity, but freedom and culture. Making the rich poorer does not make the poor richer, but it does make the state stronger, and it does increase the power of officials and politicians, power more menacing, more permanent, and less useful than market power within the rule of law. Inequality of income can only be eliminated at the cost of freedom." The reverse is also true. As personal wealth expands, the power of the state diminishes. People's freedom and dignity increases. Much of modern politics has been about how we can best enhance people's control over the services that they need. The boards of foundation hospitals or clinical commissioning groups seek to give communities a voice in how their tax money is spent on the provision of hospital or healthcare services. Academies and free schools seek to extend parental choice in the type of education that the state provides for our children by spending our taxes on our behalf. Personal independence payments seek to go further, giving those who need personal care special budgets of their own to spend on services of their own choice. A mixture of policies of this Conservative and Liberal Democrat government or its Labour predecessor in health, education or social care fix on different points on the spectrum of how much control we should be allowed in how we spend our own taxes. At a small level, the last Labour government even established the trust fund for every child, every newborn child, endowed with a small sum of taxpayers' money. As growth takes root more firmly, I think we should revisit this idea of making all citizens into savers, giving all a taste of the real freedom and independence that goes with ownership of assets. So far, both governments have agreed that some health services can be provided in private hospitals or even foreign hospitals, but neither has been prepared to see people exercising the same free choice over the kind of schools that we might be allowed to choose for our children. We should be bolder. We should accept that it is not for government to make these choices. They are better made by people making their own decisions about what is in their own best interests. Where possible, we should seek to assist people in providing for themselves without the intervention of the government at all. Of course, all these choices are easier for people who have. They are harder and more worrying for people who have not. Both sides of politics say they want equality of opportunity. we should face the fact that access to wealth can have a profound influence on opportunity. It can determine whether parents can afford to buy a house in the catchment of one of the better comprehensives. A few savings at the beginning of your career might allow you to take unpaid work experience or set up a small business. Parents trading down can help their children get on the property ladder or move to places where there is more well-paid work. Quality of life in retirement is often much better for those who have accumulated savings and pension rights. If we have a nest egg of shares to fall back on, or if we are able to downsize from a property we own to a small one, we may have sufficient wealth to see us through retirement. But the reality for many is somewhat different. Currently, over a quarter of pensioner couples, 37% of single males, 43% of single females, have less than £1,500 in savings. In fact, 28% of single female pensioners have no savings at all. So the budget measures to encourage saving are essential. The freedom to spend our pension savings in a way that is right for us is obviously right. But as I've just highlighted, more than a quarter of all pensioners have less than £1,500 in total savings. We must do everything that we can to make sure pensioners in the future do have savings. In 2007, we saw the power of the popular conviction that we should be able to cascade wealth down the generations. The pledge to increase the inheritance tax threshold to £1 million was sufficient to deter Gordon Brown from holding that honeymoon election. As David Cameron has indicated, a Conservative government should return to this theme. Perhaps it should also look at how those leaving legacies might be encouraged to spread benefits more widely amongst younger generations. Reliefs for people providing deposits for children or grandchildren buying homes. Relief if funds are paid straight into a relative's pension fund. Providing future security for a younger generation, but also reducing a potential future call on the state. The budget measures have shown us again Stuart Hall's spectacle of the popular classes on the move, under their own steam, outside the range of responsible guidance and leadership. It is a powerful force. Politics focuses a good deal on people's incomes, and it is good to see Conservatives in government once again reducing taxes on income. It focuses on how people should be allowed to influence the way in which government buys services with our taxes on our behalf. We should also make it a central purpose of government to assist more and more of the population to achieve the independence, security and freedom that comes from owning their own material stake in the world. Their own home, not forced to queue for a place to live. Their own funded pension, not subject to the vagaries of when government thinks they should be allowed to retire. Their own funds to allow them to assist the next generation in making a better life. Ladies and gentlemen, Keith Joseph was a modest man. As Margaret Thatcher observed, even though he had less than most about which to be modest. Characteristically, he said, if I had been Prime Minister, it would have been a disaster for the party, for the country, and for me. But it was the power of his ideas, working with Margaret Thatcher and others, that fired the biggest explosion of private wealth for the many, not just the few. Often unnoticed, this has also been the biggest transfer of power from the state to the people. The big idea that the Centre for Policy Studies is seeking is no more new than any other idea. Maurice Sarchi has said that his single big idea will be about freedom and money and the connection between them. I greatly look forward to hearing more about this big idea, which I understand will be unveiled at the inaugural Margaret Thatcher Conference on Liberty to be held in June. What is essential is the dignity that we have when we control our own destiny. The Conservative Party succeeds when it is most effective in spreading that dignity from British people from all social classes and backgrounds. Thank you very much.
I've always been brought up with the idea of an Englishman's home is his castle. Now, it's under this government that we have increased stamp duty, and I would like to know if there's any possibility that we'll actually be abolishing stamp duty altogether, maybe one day in the future. And the other one was, even under John Major, they were going to try and get rid of capital gains tax. All these are things that I'm sure Sir Keith Joseph would have liked to make a comment on.
Yes. The theme I started with, the importance of honesty and directness in politicians, always gets me into trouble. And I've always thought that probably the moment when we will have finally broken through, the public will trust us all, is the moment when no politician ever again says, I'm advised that I shouldn't answer hypothetical questions. So I'm going to very foolishly wade into your hypothetical question. Is there any point in the future when stamp duty will be abolished? Maybe not abolished, but I hope we'll see a time when it is very, very dramatically reduced. I certainly hope we'll see a time when the abrupt cliffs that occur in it disappear, which so clearly distort the property market. And I think that whilst I've been very clear about the importance of home ownership amongst other kinds of ownership, I think we're also all acutely aware at the moment of the difficulties that arise both for new buyers, people who aren't yet in the property market at all, the remarkable impediments that stand in the way of people seeking to enter the market, especially in some parts of the country. And for people wanting to enter the property market in London now, not only is it an extraordinarily expensive thing because of the price of the property, but the government then makes it significantly harder by applying that big wedge of stamp duty to the transaction as well. And capital gains tax, of course, is one of those things. I know, I'm not sure John Redwood is here, but John always very deftly points out that when he's making modest campaigns for reduction in CGT, he's very fond of saying, I'm only asking you to reduce it back to the level that Gordon Brown used to charge when he was Chancellor. So I think we can clearly make a strong case on both of those taxes, and we should do. But we're also very aware of the assistance that the Chancellor gets from some of those taxes, in particular the stamp duty, which comes in every year and rises every year.
In the middle, row 3.
Thank you very much. Brian Rigby. In a similar vein, it seems to me that inheritance is also a major factor in this distribution between generations. And it's notable that we always seem to be banging on about the amount that someone can give away, whereas there are other countries that look at it the other way around and tax inheritance in the hands of the recipient. And it seems to me that might be an easier route to a revolution in that direction too.
It might be, or as I was hinting as well, I think there are various different ways you might approach it. You might make the relief of inheritance taxes easier and quicker if people are good enough to be wanting to give away their money more rapidly, especially if they're spreading it more widely. So I think it's an interesting idea to look at. We might combine the two.
I'm going to the back row on the, yes, either, this side. Thank you.
Michael Johnson, I'm a researcher at CPS. A comment to the question, if I may. The comment is the observation from the budget that there is political capital to be garnered in being involved. And in the context of pensions and savings, which is my particular interest, I was delighted to see what we heard. But my question follows on from this, which is that in the ranks of the Conservative Party, be it in the Commons, the Lords and elsewhere, there is a paucity of expertise in respect of pensions and savings. And I've given evidence in select committees, both in the Lords and the Commons, where the quality of the Inquisition that I received, which I sometimes enjoyed and sometimes didn't, was very clearly focused on particularly the Labour Party and the Liberal Democrat Party. And of course we have the Liberal Democrat who's the pensions minister. So my question is, to whom should we look to amongst the Conservative Party ranks who is going to provide some leadership, and as we try to differentiate ourselves from the Liberal Democrats and run up to the next election, who's going to provide that leadership in the sphere of pensions and savings And at the moment, I don't know.
Well, I think we can take some heart from the fact that at least the Chancellor of the Exchequer has started the process of leadership on pensions and savings, which makes it easier, I think, for the rest of us. It's not an answer to your immediate question, how do we do this in the lead up to the next election, because the timescale is so short. But this is one of the reasons why I think that we ought to take seriously the whole question of serious reform of Parliament. As I said, my own inclination would be to remove the executive from Parliament altogether. You might have a smaller House of Commons. You could certainly have much more powerful committees. And I would like to see the select committees of the House assuming such dominance in the lives of the members of Parliament who sit on them, that if they don't already have the level of expertise that you would like to encounter when you're being questioned by them, that they would gain it. Because it ought to be the single most important thing in the parliamentary life of most members of Parliament. And at the moment, it isn't. It's something which very often, especially for the, apart from the Treasury Committee and the Foreign Affairs Committee, one or two of the Public Accounts Committee, sometimes quite important select committees struggle towards the end of a parliament to find members to sit on them because the significance of the role just isn't considered great enough. They're not given enough status for the role that they do, and they don't have sufficient powers to attract that esteem. So I think it is a long journey, a long task to get a parliament which does justice to sometimes the experts that appear before it and before its committees.
Staying in the back row, on the left side.
Thank you. Vincent DiLorenzo. You spoke very eloquently about economic freedom, and I guess how that leads to human freedom. And I wonder how you square that with a party in a country that taxes at the highest marginal rate of 45% of one's income. It seems to be a very important kind of thing. One of the most precious things I think anyone has to give is the value of their labor. And we're in a society where the government is effectively confiscating 50% of that. So I wonder how you respond to that, and where you think, how that would affect spending, of course, with government spending 40% of the national income, which would also have to be reduced. It seems to me to be very far from kind of a reasonable definition of human freedom. Thank you.
I think the government makes unnecessarily heavy weather of this sometimes, and when the leader of the opposition sometimes thinks he's asking that brilliant, insightful question, the Prime Minister's questions, and he says, will he rule out ever reducing the top rate of income tax again? And we end up going through a great sort of rigmarole of pointing out that wealthy people are paying more in tax now than they paid under the previous Labour government. The simple answer, surely, for Conservatives is, of course we believe in lower taxes, and we believe in lower taxes for everybody. We believe that it is more efficient, that it makes people freer, that it increases their incentives to work hard and succeed. And that applies whether you're paying 45 pence tax or 20% tax. So, of course, we should be seeking to address those things. I don't think it's any secret that at the time that the top rate was cut, there was a very lively debate within government as to whether it should be cut all the way to 40% or whether it should be the halfway house that happened. And I think it was largely the coalition partner that was the impediment to doing it. I think the politics of it was very straightforward, that it really wouldn't have made any difference to the popularity or unpopularity of the measure if you went from 50 to 40 rather than 50 to 45. In fact, in some ways, we've just made it more difficult for ourselves, and we've left an unnecessary complication in the tax system as well. So, of course, we should seek to do it, and maybe we should remind George Osborne of those heady days when he first became Shadow Chancellor and went off to Estonia and looked at flat taxes. And it would be nice to start looking again at some of those ideas for the future.
I can see, there's many questions here. I think in the middle, here, and then I'm going to come to you both. But in the middle here, please. Did I say a hand? No, well in that case, yes, you sir, please. 3 hands there. Please go ahead.
Hello.
Would you be kind enough to stand up for us?
Of course, yeah. Sorry. My name is Gary Madge-Dillon. I just want to go back to the question on inequality, because I thought it was slightly glib, the response, if I'm not being rude. The point about inequality is it doesn't matter so much if everyone is rising, necessarily as maintaining or increasing, but the comparison to the situation now is we're talking about deteriorating opportunity for the people at the bottom of the socioeconomic scale. So the point about Maurice Archer's point about housing and the power of the council housing proposition, there's people living in poor council estates, there's a capital asset there, and they could convert that, readily or buy into that, which then gave them a platform to then ascend and improve and close the equality gap. And that's missing now. There's a missing market and a ladder, if you like, for groups in society who find themselves in that situation. So what are the kind of ladders, what are the kind of risks beyond, I don't know, I mean, it just seems, it's a question of being more punitive rather than actually offering opportunity.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. And really that was the intended thrust of my remarks, that we ought to be focusing on how we spread wealth, not merely increase wealth for those who already hold it. That we ought to make sure that as wide a spectrum of the population as possible begin that journey of accumulating wealth. So I absolutely agree with the principle that there are things that can be done, things that are being done in terms of assistance for people without access to a deposit to buy a home. It has some of its own complications attached to it, but is a part of that process. There is the right to buy. You could look also, for instance, at ways of rewarding people who are social tenants in receipt of housing benefit, but who are good tenants, who do the right things, who seek to increase their income. You might look at ways that you could start to give them a stake, even if it's a minority stake in the house that they occupy, or give them the chance to build up a bigger deposit rather than just a discount in right to buy. And I referred as well to the child trust funds, which I thought, partly for obvious reasons of fiscal difficulty at the beginning of the Parliament, were abolished by the present government. But the notion that you make everybody own something right from the start of their lives and give them some incentive to think about how they save and how they build a material estate, I think is potentially powerful. And that's why I said I think we should look at it again.
Well, I think we're going to have to take one more question from the floor, and then I'm going to exercise my prerogative to ask the final question. So yes, sir, please. By the aisle.
Simon Rose from a group called Save Our Savers. I'm delighted to hear you saying we should be a nation of savers again. What worries me, though, is that we aren't. You mentioned the savings ratio, which used to be of the order of 8%, it's now only 5%, and the OBR figures accompanying the budget say it's going to fall to 3%, which is rather shocking given that any investment funds we need have to be derived from our savings pool. But what particularly worries me is our group is comprised of relatively old people. I suspect many of the more mature people here believe that thrift is of necessity a good thing. It's a very conservative idea. We have relatively few young members, but those we do have say that their friends believe that saving is a mug's game, that we're incentivising debt, we're disincentivising saving, that as a result, why should people save? And I do worry that we're going through a complete sea change in which the value of saving is being forgotten. And I wondered whether you had any comments about that, about how we might get the pendulum to swing back again.
Well, I think, one of the things that I highlighted in my remarks was that whilst what you say is true, and there is a a worrying reduction in the savings ratio. There is also a continuing expansion of private wealth, and it is quite widely spread. It needs to be more widely spread, and it needs to be spread more intergenerationally as well. But quite a lot of what has been happening, the negative trends that you describe, is entirely rational behaviour from people looking at an unprecedented period of interest rates that have been almost zero. And many people would have been right to say, saving is a mug's game, why would I do it? I'm being incentivised to spend. But I don't think many of us think that's going to go on forever, and it is going to start to turn. The natural incentives will be enhanced. And I think what was one of the many things that was encouraging about the budget 2 weeks ago was that as we look ahead to that turn starting to happen, we're also getting some of the architecture in place for savings vehicles which are more attractive, and that we're removing the disincentives from people thinking, well, why would I put money into a pension when I'm going to be forced to buy an annuity that will yield nothing, or why would I put money in when I might never be able to get out at a reasonable age. So I think getting the architecture right, seeing as money maybe starts to be worth a little bit more again, that we have the two things running together will give some hope. But I think really my main point on all of this was that it's critically important that we start to talk about it and to focus on it again and see it as a principal objective of a Conservative government. Because for too long we've either only been interested in what people have been earning, that's important of course, or only interested in the mechanisms that we might use to give people a little bit more say over how government does things for them. And we, for too long, forgot to talk about how people can be helped to do things for themselves. And I think the reaction to the budget 2 weeks ago has shown how very, very powerful that message is, and how people respond to it.
Those are marvellous questions. Thank you all very much, and thank you, Graham. Graham, can I ask you one last question, which I'm going to ask you to turn to your other role as chairman of the 1922 committee. So, most people would say that you are the leader of the men in grey suits, the most dangerous men in the Conservative Party, who hold the life of a leader in their hands at all times. So I think the audience would be really fascinated if you felt able to tell us how, in that capacity, which I know you do, but please explain to everyone how, you achieve a balance between loyalty to the leader and rebelliousness. How is that done?
Well, I think you've helped me immensely by timetabling this lecture to coincide with the second Clegg-Farage debate. Thank you all of you for coming to this instead. But hopefully that will help to keep me out of the press tomorrow. But otherwise, I say wait and see how they write this occasion up. I think that the single most important thing is that I don't quote what David Cameron says when I meet him and we have private discussions. And I think David would say that we have frank discussions and that I'm always candid. And I hope that he values that. But what I know that he does say he values is the fact that he doesn't know read about what we discussed in the newspapers afterwards. So that's the most important thing. But I think there is a really important central point, and I think this is true in any organisation, which is that as long as you're all willing the same ends, willing the same success, in this case willing the election of a Conservative government at the next election, challenge internally helps. And sometimes it's hard to see that, but it's like having good non-executive directors. You want people to ask the difficult questions, You want people to highlight where things might be done differently and where the problems and pitfalls might be. So I actually believe that the system, the 1922 committee, I think is an asset and helps any Conservative Party leader to do their job better.
Thank you, Graham. I think you will all, please come to the end. Would you all join me in thanking Graham for this lecture?